Hi, my name is Stef van Elzen and I'm from the Eindhoven University of Technology. And in this video I will present our work on the flow of trust. These are the results of a recent DAGS-tool on interactive visualization for fostering trust in machine learning. And as such, it was joint work with Gennady and Natalia Andrienko, Brian Fisher, Rafael Martins, Jaakko Peltonen, Alex Telea, and Michel Verleysen. Now in this work we argue that we need a visualization framework to externalize, explore and explain trust in machine learning and visual analytics applications. If we look at AI or artificial intelligence or machine learning, then it becomes more and more important and also more and more complex. And the techniques from explainable AI, they help to understand the model and the relations between the input and the output. However, they do not directly cover building trust in the model or the process leading to this. So providing explanations typically help to increase the trust, but not necessarily. So let me explain. Because even if a system provides a perfect explanation of how the model works, the user might still not trust it. For example, due to wrong model decisions or incorrect output. Now, the reverse also holds. So, although explainable AI might show a model's flaws, users might still have a high trust in the system. For example, due to faith in the authority or the organization behind it. Or because they simply lack the domain knowledge to understand the explanations. So, next to understanding the model with explainable AI techniques, an equally important aspect, or even more important, is the trust or lack of trust in machine learning applications. Now what we see is that trust in machine learning applications is typically an implicit process that takes place in the user's mind. So currently, if you look at visual analytics and machine learning applications, they lack an interface for expressing this trust or distrust. And there is no method of feedback or communication of trust that can be acted on. However, if we look at recent surveys on visualization techniques for understanding machine learning models, then trust is actually mentioned as one of these most important goals. But in none of the works it is discussed how to directly achieve this or manage this in a concrete manner. So this motivated us to think about how to actually bridge the gap. And first of all, we believe that trust should be treated as a first-class citizen. And we came up with a conceptual framework that captures the flow of trust. What this means I will explain later. But this framework helps in designing and reasoning about visual analytics applications that use machine learning while taking into account trust on all different levels and stages. So for example, expressing the trust, exploring the trust, communicating trust, and developing trust. So how did we get to this framework? So we started by considering a traditional machine learning pipeline and then developed from there. So typically you start with the training data and then you have the test data or post-training data in general with new instances that you, for example, want to classify, right? Then based on this training data, we train or we build the model, and then we have a model. And then we can use this new model, or we can use this model on new instances, and then finally we come to a model output. Now this is what we consider the traditional machine learning process. Certain things like monitoring and retraining are not explicitly there, but we consider these as new iterations or reiterations of parts of this presented pipeline. So this is the pipeline that we that we started with. Now, typically, you also have a user that is interacting with the process or the artifacts of this pipeline. So for example, here we have a user setting certain parameters of the training algorithm, and then the effect of this parameter change is observed as an effect. And these effects, they can be simple, they can be complex. Also, for example, it can be explainable AI techniques here. But what you see is that this is typically an iterative process, right, of setting parameters, observing the effects, changing different parameters, seeing the effect again. And based on this loop, this iterative approach, users reach actually a trust conclusion. And this trust conclusion or belief of trust is constantly updated while exploring the results and setting parameters. However, the problem with this is that trust is formed in the mind of the user. So this is rather implicit. And also, this trust does not explain why the user reached this conclusion, right? So therefore, we believe that actually feedback is needed to make this explicit. So what is trusted or mistrusted, and why is it trusted or mistrusted? So we argue that all of these should actually be made explicit. So the trust, but also the communication of this trust, the formation of this trust, and the feedback of this trust. So it should be made as an explicit part of this pipeline. So both on representing current trust and representing current trust here, for example, but also interaction methods should be provided where we can set this trust, right? So and we can provide feedback, and perhaps we also want to see how this trust developed over time to come to this trust conclusion. Now, so this is for one stage of the pipeline, but each of the objects in the pipeline have such a similar process. And here you have different user roles. Typically, users are different. For example, you have the model end users and you have the model developers and the persons collecting the data or annotating the data. But they can be the same. So we assume here user roles. And for example, in a research or a prototyping setting, these might be the same user. So within each step, this trust is actually formed, but also this trust should travel along the machine learning pipeline to connect the different user roles with each other. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, it should travel forward, for example, to convince subsequent users that the objects that they are provided with are trustworthy enough, right? But it also propagates backwards because, for example, at a certain stage, people might not trust the results and then want to propagate this backwards, right? So and then upon receiving these signals of mistrust, then the earlier steps, they actually need to adapt their objects, right, and fix these issues. So what is the role of visualization here? Well, actually, we believe that the role of interactive visualization for this trust formation within, but also between the stages, is actually crucial because it enables the exploration of the machine learning objects in the parameter and effect loop, but it also enables users to express the feedback, for example, by annotating certain parts of the object, and also it enables the explicit representation of trust within one stage, but also between the stages, right? So, and for all of these, we need interaction to update and visualization to make this explicit, because it's an iterative approach that's constantly updated. So, what is the intended use of the framework? So, with this framework, we actually hope to define and guide a new research area in visual analytics. This framework is just the first step to help users think about the different aspects of trust. So, for example, the externalization of trust might be different for each of these objects, but also how do we represent this trust, and how do we combine it, and how do we make sure it can be shared between the different user roles. So here the focus actually of our framework is on the expression and the communication of trust. So explicitly modeling, interacting, and visualizing trust with this framework generates new questions and open areas for research. So from the conceptual framework, we suggest 5 open areas for research that we think are important and the field should focus on. So the first one is about trust objects. So as a first step towards developing applications with explicit trust, all the trust objects should be identified and categorized using a taxonomy. And then for each trust object in this taxonomy, there are different trust challenges that play a role. So, for example, for the data object, trust in gathering the data, collecting the data, but also then annotating or labeling the data plays a role. And this is very different for model output, for example, because there, for model output, trust in the model as well as subsets of the output are formed by a user. So to fully support this as intended by the framework, we need to identify all these trust objects and understand the reasons for trust or distrust, and place these in a taxonomy so that we can think and reason about these objects. So second, trust can actually be expressed in many ways. So for example, through interactive widgets, but also much broader, like sending emails from one user to another, or oral communication, or in a bug reporting system. So to be able to reason about the most effective and efficient way of externalizing trust, we need to come up with generic formalisms to represent trust in a machine-readable form. Now, if we have that, then another important open area of research is the exploration of which visualization and interaction mechanisms are the most effective to express this trust. And with this, there are many related questions. So, for example, if you look at trust, then what is actually the coarseness in which trust should be represented? Right? Should it be very fine-grained or should it be very coarse? And how many levels are actually appropriate? And are they similar for each of these trust objects? Also, is the trust scale, is it linear or is it something else entirely? And related and equally important is the flow of trust. So visualization actually can act here as a common ground between the different stages. Why? Because the visualizations can be shared between the stages and the users, for example, so they have some common objects that they both understand and can interact with to communicate the trust. But next to this, also provenance plays a role here. So how do we capture, how do we monitor, and how do we visualize the evolution of trust over time? And finally, similar to exploratory visualization, where users are guided and steered towards interesting patterns, trust can also be used for guidance. And how to do this is actually still an open question. So to conclude, we observe that trust in machine learning and visual analytics applications is an implicit process that takes place in the user's mind. And currently, there is no method of feedback or communication of trust that can be acted upon. So we actually argue that trust should be externalized and treated as a first-class citizen. And in this spirit, we present a framework that creates awareness and that helps users in developing interactive visualizations to help users build and communicate trust. And the key to our framework is this feedback loop within one stage and between stages to support this flow of trust. Now, also in addition to the framework, we identified and discussed 5 directions for future work, and we are looking forward to solutions from the community and all the creative ways in which this framework will be used. But I trust this will be great. Thanks for listening.